For more than 60 years, James Bond has changed faces, cars, villains, and generations. But while 007 always seems to stay the same age, the actors behind the legend didn't. Some became Hollywood icons. Some walked away from the spotlight. Some returned to the Bond universe decades later. And sadly, many of the unforgettable faces from the earliest films are no longer with us. From Sean Connery and Roger Moore to Pierce Brosnan and Daniel Craig. From unforgettable Bond women to villains audiences still remember today. We're traveling through more than 6 decades of 007 history to discover what happened to the stars after their missions ended. This is James Bond, then, and now. Sean Connery, the Bond who started it all. In 1962, audiences heard 4 words that would change movie history. Bond. James Bond. The man delivering them was Sean Connery, a 32-year-old Scottish actor who became the first James Bond to lead an official Eon Productions feature film. From Dr. No to From Russia with Love and Goldfinger, Connery helped create the screen image of 007 that audiences still recognize today. He ultimately appeared as Bond in 6 Eon films between 1962 and 1971, before returning to the character years later in the independently produced Never Say Never Again. But Connery eventually proved he was much more than James Bond. He went on to appear in films including The Untouchables, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and The Hunt for Red October. His performance in The Untouchables earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Connery eventually retired from acting and spent his later years largely away from Hollywood. He died in 2020 at the age of 90. More than 6 decades after Dr. No, countless actors have worn the tuxedo. But Sean Connery remains the man who first made millions believe they were watching James Bond. George Lazenby, the one-time Bond. In 1969, James Bond suddenly had a new face. George Lazenby was just 30 when he took over from Sean Connery in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. What made his story extraordinary was that Lazenby had very little acting experience before landing one of the biggest roles in cinema. And then, after just one Bond movie, he walked away from 007. His decision made him unique. Lazenby remains the only actor to play Bond just once in the official Eon film series. 4 years, On Her Majesty's Secret Service was often treated as an unusual chapter in Bond history. But over time, the film gained a much stronger reputation among fans and critics, particularly for its more emotional portrayal of Bond. Lazenby continued acting, appearing in films and television, but he never again reached the level of fame that came with 007. Decades later, seeing the young man who once replaced Sean Connery is one of the most striking reminders of just how long James Bond has been on our screens. One movie, one mission, and a place in Bond history that nobody else can claim. Roger Moore, the Bond of a new generation. In 1973, Roger Moore stepped into the tuxedo for Live and Let Die. He was 45, making him older at his Bond debut than Connery or Lazenby had been. But Moore brought something completely different to 007. His Bond was lighter, more playful, and often more humorous. Over the next 12 years, Moore starred in 7 official Bond films, including The Spy Who Loved Me, Moonraker, and For Your Eyes Only. By the time A View to a Kill arrived in 1985, Moore was 57. He remains the actor with the most appearances as Bond in the official Eon film series. After leaving 007, Moore continued acting but increasingly devoted his life to humanitarian work, becoming a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. He died in 2017 at the age of 89. From his first appearance in 1973 to his final mission 12 years later, audiences actually watched Roger Moore grow older while playing James Bond. 7 movies, 12 years. One unforgettable 007. Timothy Dalton, the darker Bond. In 1987, James Bond changed again. Timothy Dalton was 41 when he made his debut as 007 in The Living Daylights. After the lighter tone of the Roger Moore era, Dalton brought something noticeably different to the character. His Bond was tougher, more serious, and more emotionally intense. Dalton returned 2 years later in License to Kill, a darker and more personal story that pushed Bond into new territory. But then his time as 007 came to an unexpected end. Legal disputes surrounding the Bond franchise delayed the next movie for years, and Dalton eventually stepped away from the role. That meant he appeared in only 2 Bond films. Dalton continued acting long after 007, appearing in projects including Hot Fuzz, Penny Dreadful, and The Crown. And decades later, his tougher interpretation of Bond feels surprisingly close to the direction the franchise would eventually take. 2 movies were enough to give James Bond a very different edge. Pierce Brosnan, the Bond of the 1990s. In 1995, Pierce Brosnan finally introduced himself as James Bond in GoldenEye. Brosnan was 42, but his road to 007 had actually started years earlier. He had previously been considered for the role in the 1980s, but his television commitments prevented him from taking it. When his opportunity finally arrived, GoldenEye successfully brought Bond into a new post-Cold War era. Brosnan combined the elegance and humor associated with earlier Bonds with the faster action of 1990s blockbusters. He returned in Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Die Another Day. Across 4 movies, Brosnan's Bond encountered invisible cars, enormous explosions, unforgettable villains, and some of the most famous Bond women of the era. After leaving the franchise, Brosnan continued a successful career in movies including Mamma Mia, The Thomas Crown Affair, and many others. More than 30 years after GoldenEye, seeing Brosnan today creates one of the clearest then and now comparisons in the entire Bond story. For an entire generation, when someone said 007, this was the face they saw. Daniel Craig, the Bond who changed the rules. When Daniel Craig was announced as the next James Bond, not everyone was convinced. Then Casino Royale arrived in 2006. Craig was 38 when audiences watched his Bond earn his 00 status and begin his journey as a younger, rougher, and more vulnerable version of the character. His first mission became a major success, and the skepticism quickly began to disappear. Craig returned in Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, Spectre, and finally No Time to Die. Across 5 films and 15 years, audiences watched his Bond change in a way previous versions rarely had. He fell in love. He suffered loss. He grew older. And his story eventually reached an ending no previous official Bond era had attempted in quite the same way. After leaving 007, Craig continued reinventing himself with roles far removed from Bond, including Detective Benoit Blanc in the Knives Out films. From Casino Royale to No Time to Die, Daniel Craig didn't simply play James Bond. He gave 007 something Bond had rarely been allowed to have: an ending. Ursula Andress, the original Bond woman. In 1962, one scene helped create the image of the Bond woman for generations. Ursula Andress was 26 when she appeared as Honey Rider in Dr. No. Her entrance from the Caribbean Sea became one of the most recognizable moments in the entire James Bond franchise. But Dr. No was only the beginning. Andress continued acting internationally throughout the 1960s and 1970s, appearing alongside some of the biggest stars of the era. Yet decades later, it is Honey Rider that audiences still associate with her most strongly. More than 60 years have passed since she walked onto that beach. And the woman who helped define the Bond era became one of its longest-lasting icons. Barbara Bach, the spy who matched Bond. In 1977, Barbara Bach entered the Bond universe as Major Anya Amasova in The Spy Who Loved Me. She was 29 when she played the Soviet agent known as XXX. And unlike many earlier women in the franchise, Anya wasn't simply following Bond. She was a trained intelligence officer with her own mission, and frequently his equal. The Spy Who Loved Me became one of Roger Moore's most celebrated Bond films, and Bach became one of the era's most recognizable Bond women. She continued acting for several years before largely stepping away from the screen. Her life then took another famous turn when she married Ringo Starr in 1981. Decades later, Bach remained instantly recognizable to Bond fans as the spy who could challenge 007 at his own game. Bond had finally met someone who wasn't impressed by the tuxedo. Sophie Marceau, the woman Bond couldn't read. In 1999, The World Is Not Enough introduced audiences to Sophie Marceau as Electric King. Marceau was 32 when she entered Pierce Brosnan's Bond era, and her character was far more complicated than she first appeared. Elegant, vulnerable, and dangerous, Elektra blurred the traditional line between Bond woman and Bond villain. By then, Marceau was already a major star in France, having first become famous as a teenager. She continued working extensively in European cinema after Bond, building a career far beyond the 007 franchise. More than 25 years later, seeing Electra King beside Sophie Marceau today creates exactly the kind of transformation this story is about. Because in Bond's world, the most dangerous person in the room isn't always the one holding the gun. Halle Berry, a new generation of Bond woman. In 2002, Halle Berry emerged from the ocean in Die Another Day as NSA agent Jinx Johnson. The scene deliberately echoed Ursula Andress's legendary entrance in Dr. No 40 years earlier. But Berry arrived at a very different moment in Bond history. She was 36 and had already become a major Hollywood star. Earlier that same year, Berry had won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Monsters Ball. As Jinx, she wasn't simply Bond's romantic interest. She carried weapons, pursued her own mission, and fought alongside Brosnan's 007. Barry continued her career through major films and television projects long after leaving the Bond universe. And putting her 2002 appearance beside her today creates another striking reminder of how much time has passed. 40 years after Ursula Andress walked out of the sea, Bond history repeated itself, with a completely different generation. Christopher Lee, the man with the golden gun. In 1974, Roger Moore's Bond faced an assassin who seemed almost as sophisticated as 007 himself. Christopher Lee was 52 when he played Francisco Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun. By then, Lee was already famous for his horror roles, particularly his performances as Count Dracula. But his career was far from over. Decades later, an entirely new generation discovered him as Saruman in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit films, and as Count Dooku in the Star Wars universe. That extraordinary career stretched across generations of movie history. Lee died in 2015 at the age of 93. From Dracula to Scaramanga, Saruman and Count Dooku, Christopher Lee didn't simply play villains. He became one of cinema's greatest masters. Richard Kiel, Jaws. When Richard Kiel appeared in The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977, audiences met one of the strangest and most unforgettable villains in Bond history. At more than 7 feet tall, Kiel was almost impossible to miss. But it was Jaws' enormous metal teeth that turned the character into an icon. He became so popular that something unusual happened for a Bond villain. He came back. Kiel returned as Jaws in Moonraker in 1979, where the seemingly unstoppable villain even revealed a surprisingly softer side. Outside Bond, Kiel continued appearing in movies and television and later became recognizable to another generation through films including Happy Gilmore. He died in 2014 at the age of 74. Decades after Jaws first smiled at the camera, Bond fans still remember those metal teeth. Sometimes a villain doesn't need many words to become unforgettable. Mads Mikkelsen, Lucifer. In 2006, Mads Mikkelsen entered the Bond universe as Lucifer in Casino Royale. He was 40 when he faced Daniel Craig's newly introduced 007. Instead of trying to destroy the world, Lucifer was a desperate financier trying to recover money he had lost, making him a very different kind of Bond villain. The film's poker confrontation became one of the defining sequences of Craig's first Bond adventure. But for Mikkelsen, Bond was only one chapter. He went on to become an internationally recognized actor through projects including Hannibal, Doctor Strange, Rogue One, and Another Round. Years after Casino Royale, Mikkelsen remains one of the most recognizable actors to have faced 007 during the modern Bond era. Bond won the game, but Lucifer helped redefine what a modern Bond villain could be. Javier Bardem, Silva. In 2012, Javier Bardem appeared in Skyfall as Raul Silva, one of the most personal enemies Bond had ever faced. Bardem was 43 when he transformed himself with Silva's distinctive blonde appearance. But behind the unusual look was already an Academy Award-winning actor. Bardem had won Best Supporting Actor for No Country for Old Men, where he played another unforgettable villain, Anton Chigurh. In Skyfall, Silva wasn't simply trying to defeat Bond. His real obsession was M, played by Judi Dench. That connection turned the conflict into something much more personal than another mission to save the world. Bardem continued taking on major roles after Bond, while Silva became one of the defining villains of the Daniel Craig era. Different decade, different kinds of enemies. Same impossible job for 007. The man who outlasted Bond. When Judi Dench first appeared as M in GoldenEye in 1995, Pierce Brosnan was the new James Bond. Dench was 60, and immediately gave Bond something he wasn't always accustomed to. A boss who wasn't impressed by him. She continued as M throughout Brosnan's era. Then, when the franchise rebooted with Daniel Craig in Casino Royale, something remarkable happened. Dench stayed. She became a bridge between two completely different Bond eras, appearing opposite both Brosnan and Craig. Her story as M eventually reached its emotional conclusion in Skyfall in 2012. By then, 17 years had passed since her first appearance in GoldenEye. Dench continued her extraordinary acting career beyond Bond, adding 007 to a legacy that stretches across stage, television, and cinema. Bonds came and went. But for 17 years, M remained. More than 60 years of 007. More than 60 years. 6 actors have carried James Bond through the official Ian film series. Countless missions, unforgettable allies, dangerous villains, and generations of movie history. Sean Connery introduced audiences to a new kind of movie hero. George Lazenby gave Bond one of his most emotional stories. Roger Moore brought humor and charm to Seven Adventures. Timothy Dalton showed audiences a darker 007. Pierce Brosnan carried Bond into the modern blockbuster era. And Daniel Craig gave the character something audiences had rarely seen before: vulnerability, age, and ultimately an ending. But James Bond was never just the man wearing the tuxedo. It was Ursula Andress walking out of the sea, Richard Kiel smiling with those unforgettable metal teeth, Judi Dench staring across her desk as M, Halle Berry introducing a new generation to the world of 007, and villains like Christopher Lee, Mads Mikkelsen and Javier Bardem giving Bond someone worth fighting. Some of these stars are still with us today. Others have become part of movie history. But on screen something remarkable happens. Sean Connery is still 32. Roger Moore is still beginning his first mission. Pierce Brosnan is still walking into the casino in GoldenEye. And Daniel Craig is still ordering his first Vesper. The actors grew older. The world around them changed. But James Bond never really did. So which 007 era will always be yours? Connery? Moore? Brosnan? Craig? Or someone else? Tell us in the comments. And if you love traveling back through Hollywood history to discover what happened to the stars we grew up watching, subscribe to Hollywood Evolution TV. Because after more than 60 years, Bond is still Bond. James Bond.